We have a couple of ventures in the US, a couple of ventures in Europe, and then obviously a few ventures in Africa. And the single biggest impact on whether the business will be successful, in my opinion, is
And some of that cards could be this is your third startup. It could be you're 40 years old and you have a nice network. Or it's like you're 20 and you're super charismatic and you somehow can convince people to do the impossible.
a lot of things that I would do differently, as with any venture. But there's a lot of things that I wouldn't have done differently. And I think that was really around.
Hi, I'm Bobby.
And I'm Renier, and this is How Would You Build It, a podcast where we interview South African startup founders, business builders, and tech innovators.
And if you like our content, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you're informed of new episodes. But for now, enjoy the show. Welcome back, everybody, to How Would You Build It? It's been a long time. We are now kicking off season 2.0. I don't know, Renee, what we're going to call it, but it's good to have you back. How are you doing after all these months of not doing the show? How are you doing?
Yeah, great. I missed looking at your beautiful face every week, Bobby.
Yeah, this beard, it's gotten a bit grayer every here, a little bit, yes, but it's good to be back.
The winter touches, a little bit of snow.
Yeah, there we go. You've also grown a bit of a beard over the time.
Exactly.
So, yeah, did I inspire you?
Definitely.
I'm really excited because we've got Louis, who was one of my previous employers, and working at the Delta was a great time for me. I learned a lot. It was a great environment to be in. And so it's awesome to have Louis join us on the podcast. Louis, all the way from Berlin. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Very excited.
Nice. Yeah, I think I have to say, Louis, that Renier's brought up the Delta a number of times in passing in different conversations and stuff. And one of the comments he actually made to me a while ago was, what was Louis doing? What was the Delta doing that they were able to create a number of successful startups in South Africa? It wasn't just one, it wasn't just two. There was quite a few. And I was privileged to be around and actually see some of those little children's get born and yeah, it was fascinating and it was quite an environment that you guys had created, and I think that's what we would like to dive in today. So I remember we used to go for coffee way before I even started working at the Delta. We would go for
Yeah.
coffee, you would share your ideas and what you guys were thinking about doing, and um, yeah, I mean, just tell us that birth of the Delta and what that initial. So I remember when we first met, you had like 5 people in the company, and then the next minute there were over 100.
Yeah, no, I think you remember it just the same way I did. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, in these things, a lot of what you remember is, I think, not really. I mean, hindsight's not really 2020, I think. So the feeling that we had at that time and like the work that we put in, I mean, I think a lot of it was just really hard work at the time. And I think when it's exciting and it's really something that you love, and that matches then with like a market opportunity, right? So at the time, I mean, that was basically our 2018, 2019, really. I mean, it's no secret that was pretty much the right time to get into anything to do with venture. I mean, probably it was earlier than that, but it was just a very, very exciting market to be in, right? So, I mean, those early days, I think we met for coffee a couple of times, and I was telling you some crazy things of what I thought was going to happen.
I
Um,
remember you talking about venture builders. I remember you saying, okay, we've got a product manager. How do we have a venture builder? I
a
mean, that
venture
was like the
manager.
birth of those
Yeah,
ideas,
yeah.
and that actually spawned into reality.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I remember those early days when we were trying to piece together this kind of uniting framework of which roles are actually required to build out a venture from beginning to end. And we spent a ton of time really trying to codify that, which, in hindsight, we threw a lot of away because I realized after the pursuit of trying to do that, that the variance is very difficult to manage. And I think that a lot of the, I would say, empirical knowledge that I use now really comes from trying to refine that model over and over again. And I think that it was a journey. I mean, like we did a lot of things that I would do differently, as with any venture, but there's a lot of things that I wouldn't have done differently. And I think that was really around the culture and the excitement that we managed to build, right? No, I think having seen a couple of different ventures at many different stages now, there is a natural journey to the energy and culture of a company, right?
Mm.
And the really good founders like realize that in the beginning, like it's the only thing that really makes it work because it's kind of a wacky equation. It's basically like far too few people with absolutely no skills or experience that are relevant most of the time, trying to, with no money, whack together something that eventually like succeeds, right? So it really is that you need that like secret sauce, that special vibe in the beginning. And if you don't manage to create that in whatever way, like those ventures, I mean, I would say they don't not succeed, but it's much harder to overcome the kind
Mm,
of gravity that you need to overcome. And I think that's something that
mm.
I think we did very well in those early days.
Yeah, so Louis, just that's a very interesting thing, and I'd love to hear more about it. But just, do you think that is something that is very specific to younger founders? Like, I see this often with people between their 20s and 30s. They're naive enough where they go, "We can change the world," and they are inexperienced enough to not know how complicated it is to do that. So they just act like they're going to do it, and everybody around them believe them, and then
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
they end up doing something amazing.
Yeah, I would say, look, I would say that there's part of it which is the outlook or like just believing you can do it. Like the I think the case that you're mentioning really is if you're a younger founder, like that's all you have. It's not like you're going off a base of credibility or experience. It's not like you're walking from $1 billion exit into something else, right? Like it's much easier for people to believe that you're going to achieve something or you're going to change the world if you've just exited for like a couple of billion and like, a couple of billion helps,
Yeah,
right? Working hard helps. A
exactly.
couple of billion helps a lot too. So I would say that what you're mentioning is like you have to build this kind of culture in those cases where people, realize or think that you can defy the odds. The reality is often the business looks very different when it actually does get to that point. But it's just a stage you kind of have to go through. And I guess yeah, that's it. Without it, it's not really possible. I would say that we work with a lot of different founders, but in the studio mainly second or third time founders, and a second or third time founder who has had a business for a while, has an exit, like what they draw on to motivate people is just very different to what a
Mm,
first time founder that's very charismatic or like that kind of feeling. It's just very different what notes they hit, what they lean on, and how they motivate the teams, right?
Mm.
And I find it very fascinating just to see. But there's no right way. It's basically
mm.
just each of them has their own pitfalls, that's for sure. And
And I mean, as you're talking about it, Lou, it makes me think about like you get cards dealt your way, right? And some of that cards could be this is your third startup, it could be you're 40 years old and you have a nice network, or it's like you're 20 and you're super charismatic and you somehow can convince people to do the impossible. So, all
that's
of them,
it.
like you say, have trade-offs. It's just you use whatever you have to make sure you make progress.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the thing that I think a lot of founders don't think about the fact that this is one of many startups, right? So you'll find people who, if you are a young founder and you are going to try and build, the first business and you've got nothing, like you've got to make some progress, right? You'll get an
Mm,
opportunity to be a not so young founder building another business, and you'll get an opportunity one day possibly to be an older founder with an exit behind your name.
mm,
But knowing that this is the level you're playing, you have to play into it, right? And I
mm,
feel like if you're not willing to play into that level right now, like then you're not able to generate the kind of motivation, you're not able to generate the energy, you're not able to generate the interest from investors. I mean, most angel investors are, I mean, it's like I find super young founders trying to pretend like they've got everything sorted out. Where like if you've been in the game for a while and you see a super young founder who has a lot of potential, like that like most of that stuff is complete rubbish. Like, but you still the journey of backing them is the fun part, right? And that's one of the things I get the
yeah.
biggest kick out of for the studio. And I think that's really like when you work with founders and there's like a genuine care for them, like that's really where I think that like you build long-term relationships and you build successful ventures, right? I find that a lot of people build like structures that are aimed to do X number of, you know, like things, and you get them into a cohort and then you provide some stuff. Like these things I find are very difficult to make work properly just because,
Mm.
the actual impact is not that high. But yeah,
But I want to dive into that because you talk about the studio, and I mean that's how I remember the Delta Studio, and what in essence it was creating an environment or putting the pieces of the puzzle for us for a startup to actually have a path of success, right? And so you spoke about culture earlier. So you hired people that would bring culture and that you could sort of, I don't like the word, but groom. You could kind of, you had a lot of young minds coming out of varsity that you could sort of mold and say, well, this is product, this is, UX, this is so forth and so forth. And in that you had all these different startups that were busy incubating or accelerating. And so what you're doing at the same time is you've got this culture, and then you've also got this IP that's kind of busy brewing as you're learning. And so what you're doing is you're plugging in, and I want you to just elaborate on this and explain it. But you're kind of plugging in these startups into this ecosystem where there's all this IP just brewing and learning and kind of bouncing off each other. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I got exposed to a lot of different startups, industries, you name it, and I just saw that sort of ecosystem building up. So I don't know if you just want to touch on that and what of that studio still exists.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, as with any business, I mean, I look back every year and think that like 1 year ago, me, I was like, what are you doing, right? Like you absolutely completely cooked. But I mean, so I mean, the studio is,
It still happens, Louis. How many years on?
yeah, so I don't think it changes, right? But
Exactly.
so I mean, back then, I think we were much more. I was much more gut feel about these items, right? And you don't really know, like it feels right to be putting people who you think you would co-found a business with together in a business. It felt right, it felt right to when you meet somebody and they have a bit of a spark. And these days, I know more of how to quantify or articulate what type of spark you're looking for, right? And that's, I think, one of the bedrocks of our studio now is really these 10 items we look for in founders, because ideally we're backing them before they've even founded the venture, right? Like pre-idea. And back then it was kind of more of just a gut feel, like find people, hire them, people who are, naturally very hungry to do anything, right? And that if you look at a founder, like a founder has to be completely bent to do what you do. Like you have to wake up early, you have to go to sleep, you think about it the whole night, like these kind of things. Like this is not like a freelance data science role, right? Like these are like people who have that kind of spunk, and I think that we hired very well for that for quite a while. And I think as the kind of market shifted, well, I mean, let me get to that now, but in that like primordial soup, right? There were just a few different key, I would say, mixing strategies, right? Which came obviously from the corporate side in one angle, came from the personal experience side of myself, came from just random things we would see, and in this bigger mix, you start to identify like which individuals you would back to build a venture. And to be honest, one thing I realized after that is that the culture and the setup that we built in those years, and even to date, like one of the biggest things I think it did for individuals in that situation is that it made them think that building a business is possible, if not easy, which I mean has probably caused them much pain since then. But
No,
still,
Louis, I actually think the contrary. I mean, one of the things that I was excited about chatting is like we meet with a lot of founders, we interview them, we write about them, we share their stories, and very regularly I come across someone that worked at the Delta. So not even a portfolio company, it's just someone who left there, probably with a lot of PTSD.
yeah.
And then I'm just joking. And
I mean,
then
if they were good, they left with PTSD. I'm kidding.
yeah, if they worked hard, they would have
Yeah.
had PTSD.
If they weren't, they
But
just
then, but then,
yeah.
but then having the confidence to say, you know what, I actually know how to do this, and or I've seen this being done before, even if it didn't work, like I've seen this before. That is super valuable. Like I mean, the amount of work that the Delta did for the South African startup ecosystem by just equipping. I mean, you were like the startup university a few years ago. Like if you wanted to learn how to do startup, go work at the Delta. And
Yeah.
and there's something there which I'd love to unpack. Like, what do you think that was? Was it a methodology? Was it a culture? Was it just finding smart people that are hungry for startups? Like how do we recreate that?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things, but and it's one of the things that you mentioned now that I'm most proud of really is the it's not always that a business comes out of Delta or doesn't come out of Delta, but somebody comes out of Delta and then eventually founds at Delta and leaves. And at the end of the day, it's not always that we're backing them onwards from that journey, right? Which is completely natural, right? I
Sure.
think there's always this kind of overlap, or if you do or if you don't, right? And I think the biggest element and driver to that, which is what I'm saying I was most proud of in those years, is it is, I think, a cultural element of just the audacity to just to do it, right? And like, to be honest, like you recite the story of like young founder just saying like it's possible and just doing this stuff, right? I mean, like at the time early on in Delta, like I'd done a few ventures. It had one or two successes, but and I was probably just at the stage where I realized like that it's probably completely possible to do again. And I just kind of just went all in and just kind of, didn't take any barrier as, any type of give it any heed, right? And like if that's the culture that you build the early team on, and that's the culture that you basically build the rest of whoever you're hiring, especially in a very big hiring growth stage, which for us was during COVID, right? I mean, during COVID was also a crazy mix of people getting laid off that were very good, people
Mm.
being willing to take a chance because COVID was such a massive shift, and us being at the stage where we were willing to lean into it as opposed to like look at what could be lost, right? And that really gave us like a very big growth spurt into these kind of individuals that would be very difficult for you to acquire that kind of talent quickly in normal circumstances, right? And
But
in that whole mix, like just the audacity to say like we're gonna go and do this in Europe, and like which to be honest with you, like it gives you like a few claps, six love, right? Like it's we can get onto that, but it's something that I just was like, you know what, like there's no rule that says you can't do it. Like people do it all
Yeah.
the time, and like I didn't realize how infrequently people do it, but
Yeah.
then you just go and do it. And I think is personally what rubbed off on a lot of people who are around, no matter if they were in the engineering team, if they're in the product team, venture team, the number of people who eventually just kind of just left and said, I'm starting something, or I'm starting something on the
Mm,
side, or I'm starting something here, or like, I think that's really what made the volume of people who are willing to do it the case,
mm,
and then
mm,
mixed with the network of the individuals around. So, Bobby,
mm,
as you mentioned, we had a lot of people like hanging around, and they were always mixing in and around. And I
mm,
think that also created a lot of early network for these individuals, right?
mm. But I think you're missing something else, Louis, that I thoroughly enjoyed and haven't seen since, which is how you guys approached, figuring out the problem. How you actually approached, someone came to you with an idea, someone came with you with that initial kind of thinking or whatever it was, and you and Alex would come with these frameworks that have now become a little bit more, oh, we all know about them, business model canvas. But back then, no one was really talking about it in the South African market. So you kind of had this, you created this awesome toolbox, and you were trying to sort of formulate what, and I'm supposing when we talk about campus, maybe it's in there too. But that's what I thoroughly enjoyed, is how you guys actually sat down with the problem with the founder that had a bit of funding, and then let's unpack it. Let's figure out how we're going to approach it. And you don't need to be a startup to use this toolbox. You can be in a scale up, you can
Mhm.
be in a normal business. And I thoroughly enjoyed, and I think you haven't touched on that. And I think that was one of my favorite things about being at the Delta, was being exposed to those frameworks that you would then unpack with these startups.
Yeah, I mean, fair point. I often overlook it afterwards because once you've worked with it for so long, it's kind of just the way that your brain works, right? Like how you validate, how you go through
Mm,
the stages. And I mean, obviously you worked with Alex extensively. I mean, Alex is like the framework.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know what type of,
Muse,
yeah, she's
guru,
she's
I don't
like a
know.
framework, I don't know, fiend, machine, whatever. But like if there's anything, and I think that's why we always work together so well as a team, is because I would create like a big mess, and Alex
Yes.
would go in and just like this needs some structure, like this needs frameworks, and like
Louis was
and
the ideas guy. Alex was the calm down. I have to
yeah,
figure out
like
how to
this,
unpack
like
this
should
now.
we not do this? I mean, that is also just I think we were a great team in that regard, right? And I think, I mean, the frameworks, you're right. I mean that a lot of the time, especially if you look at the services team, I mean a lot of the stuff that people were applying day in day out was this, right? So it was probably a mix of those three things because once you've got the skills, you've got the audacity to go and do it, and you've got a bit of network. I mean, it's not actually, it doesn't seem like rocket science in the back, but what I've learned subsequently and what I've seen in many cases is to create the economic circumstances based on a shifting world, to create that steady state is incredibly difficult, right? And there's different models that people use to try and achieve that. But I would say now, like looking back, like I mean, we do things more refined in a more refined way now, and I think we
Mm-hmm.
get similar results, but less. Let me put it this way: I think we get similar results in the ventures that we're actually invested in. We create maybe less ventures now
Mm.
that are not like we don't mean to make. Do you know what I mean?
So
I
you're
think we
actually
still
doubling down on the frameworks on a more selected pool of startups or
it's like
ideas.
our structure. We've worked backwards in our structure to harness the value that we create. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I'm very like the number of people that like were at Delta at one point that are in ventures and message me all the time asking for like advice on term sheets and things. I love helping them, right? So like it's really a joy of mine, right? But there's definitely far more that we're not invested in than we are invested in. And
Mm.
more recently, we've kind of flipped that a little bit. There's less ventures that are coming out of us that we're not invested in, but that
Mm.
naturally means a smaller number of ventures that have more focus. So
Mm.
um, maybe that's just yeah, maybe that's my yeah. I don't know. I'd have to reflect on it a little bit.
And Louis, I mean, how does that model work, right? Because I mean, a lot of people go into startup, they go, "Oh, it's going to be 3 years, we're going to be making money." But the reality is, like, when you specifically if you need scale for something to work well, that's a 10-year journey. So now you've invested in a startup, sweat equity, sweat equity. You get your sweat equity, but you still need to eat for 10 years. Like how does that? And I'm sure it's a balancing, between different kinds of projects. But if you want to invest more as opposed to just being a services business, like how
Mm.
do you make that work to survive until you can get that exit?
Wow, yeah, that's a so there's no easy answer to it, but so what I realized in the beginning, right, is that like, services is one business model that actually, there's a lot of like best practice in a services business strategy consultancy agency.
Mm.
And like we always did that, but we never really came from that industry, right? Like it was a model for us spawned out of knowing what ventures need and being able to do it, right? So
Mm.
we kind of
And
got
those businesses are profitable by month one. So
they are, they should be. They're designed to be. And then what you get is the usual creep that most dev agencies do is they start to take sweat equity in businesses
Mm.
at certain stages, and then you kind of the further you go, the more you cannibalize revenue, and then you get
Mm.
to this point where it's the maximum revenue you can do, and like if your strategy there is to hold out all the way to the end, where either this business exits or is cash flow positive and then can return some dividends to the business, in my opinion, it doesn't work, right? Because
Mm.
the there's one big problem in the kind of dev shop taking equity stage is the adverse selection. So the ventures that are most
Mm.
likely to give you equity as a service provider are the least likely to succeed.
Mm.
That
Like,
makes sense.
so the thing is, like, actually, what you're doing is just discounting your model for like
For
loyalty
bad equity.
points, loyalty
For
points,
more pain.
Mm.
right?
You're going to try that much harder on something that's probably not going to work.
So the big challenge is really, and I realized this, and that's where the studio really was the core. I mean, that's where Delta started, right? So the studio is like a studio, and for those of you who don't know, but like is more of a direct kind of co-founding approach at a very early stage with somebody, an individual usually who has extensive experience and has built ventures and can basically really impact the journey of a venture, right? So in that case, like the equity stake in a kind of a co-founding relationship early on or a venture build relationship is much higher. than if you were to just take some sweat equity at like terms or whatever. And what that leads to really is the opportunity to build positions in ventures that have a much higher likelihood of actually yielding some sort of secondary, right? Because the venture is constituted in a way that will work, and if it can work and be attractive to the open kind of investment market, aka go VC track if it wants to, then you actually have an asset that is closer to cash, and that's very hard, right? And what we did basically is, and this is what I did kind of a few years ago, is start to separate out these businesses into business units, because the reality is that, like, to do the studio well, it's not a services business. The studio is not a services business, right?
You shouldn't think like one, because then
It doesn't at
not
all,
serve
right?
so.
It has different KPIs, it has different goals, it does completely different things, right? And what it creates is value out of network, value out of experience, and it doesn't. It often studios have people in them, but it's not the main value of a studio, right? Like, you can easily hire, especially in a non-constrained talent market. Like now, I mean, there's people in, like, anyway, hiring is very easy right now, right? Back in 2018, 2019, it was actually the opposite, which is why the services model did very well, because basically you couldn't find a developer even if you wanted to, right? So like, a lot of what I learned is, like, you need to really understand your business models well, and you need to really, really be ahead of the game with what you're using at the times. And that's, I think, where, like, the way that we managed to build ventures that were actually valuable assets, like, and detach them from the services business to a large degree, right? And then basically off the back of that, you need to get to enough scale so that the margins of the services business in non-portfolio companies can fund the rest of the business, which is it's incredibly difficult, unless you're really willing to give it like rev, right? So, I mean, the services business on our side probably peaked at probably close to 200, right? Which is enough to really get enough free cash to build a portfolio that you can then rely on, right? But the thing is, like, if it's a 10, 20, 30 person dev company taking small tickets, it doesn't work, right? It
And
can
also,
work.
I mean, a 100-person dev company is quite hungry. Like, you need to be
You gotta
selling like
feed the
crazy to keep
machine.
that
You
thing
gotta
full.
feed the machine. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's tricky.
there's a lot of scar tissue there. I think if you had to scratch, I think you guys, I remember,
Oh yeah.
yeah, some difficult conversations.
Oh yeah.
Hey,
Very difficult.
we can compare notes, Louis. We were up to 50, and I was paying already. So I don't know how you felt at 100.
Yeah. No, I mean, when 200 was across Europe and Africa was it's a different beast. At that point, it just becomes digits, like, in your head. Like, and that's it's also, experience through stuff like this is really what, like, makes a studio partner, and that's the role I play in these ventures. It makes you valuable to the ventures, because you've been there to a large degree and you've done the stuff, right? Not all the stuff, but you can imagine what a founder is going through at that time, and the advice you give is much more useful, obviously, right? And I think that I mean, it's no secret. Like, one thing I learned um, between starting Delta and getting to the point where, like, you know you're running the business later stage, right? There's very, like, I don't know how to put it. It it becomes very mathematical in what you have to do to make it work. And, like, as a founder, you grow through to later stages in your journey where, the things that would bother you and would really be something you didn't want to do, um, become things you realize are necessities to make sure that the business continues. And that's a very tough thing for founders to go through. And I mean, it was, incredibly tough. Obviously, the kind of services market has gone up and down and lots of different things. And I mean, Rainier, you mentioned, I mean, obviously you had similar experience, but these things are hard to avoid. And I mean, that's is what it is, sometimes, right?
And I think, Louis, it's also testament to the nature of our market, right? I mean, it's such a small market actually when it comes to B2B. Like, I mean, you could end up selling to everyone there could be. Like, if you have a team of 200, like, there's a good chance you've either
Yeah.
pitched or sold to most people that would be buying.
100%, right? I mean, to be honest, and I think that's one of the reasons also why people often ask me this, but when we got to the scale in South Africa, at least, and I always thought this when we were starting. I'm like, why is there nobody else? Like, why is no one else like really just like in the like, why is there no one dominating? That like it just doesn't make any sense, right? And
Yeah,
after a
a good
while,
sign
like
that you're
two,
onto
three,
something is you have competition, right? So if you don't have
yeah,
competition, you're like, what's going on?
yeah, I was like, this feels eerie, right? Obviously, it was different time, and I think we got lucky in a few ways, and some of it was obviously we got right, some of it we got lucky, and like we built to a point where then I realized, you know what, like this is great, and like I'm really enjoying building this out in SA, but I just felt that, the market size and the opportunity level, not necessarily financially. I don't think for me, it was ever really a financial decision to scale into Europe and to try and build a European base to the business. It was more a challenge level, right? And to be honest, like at the time where we started to try and do that, I mean, there's one thing which is being a South African company and then just working with the odd international client. Like that's pretty simple. Like that's okay. Like you can do that. It's limited to a few things you can do, which is obviously things that can be completely outsourced that don't require market knowledge, these things, right? But like to truly build a business that like core operates in Europe and like has pays European salaries and has client like an entire go like funnel all the way from brand through to building like the actually delivering on a couple of business models is incredibly difficult. And for me, I got to that stage in South Africa where I just thought it just is not big enough. And then I realized that's probably why there are not that many businesses that look like, well, of 200 plus, because they kind of immediately change focus. And I felt this a lot. I mean, South Africa is obviously my home and like where grew up, and felt very weird like not focusing on it for a long time and not talking about it and not going to the events and not being in the same places and like just like kind of being away, and then you come back and it's like a completely different world for a bit, right? It was a very interesting journey, I must say.
So, what are the lessons that you're learning now being overseas for founders? I mean, if you had to put a South African context onto the guys that are, hustling here in the South, what are the lessons that you want to tell them? I mean, now that you're branching out, what's going to make them successful if they want to expand?
So, so I think the simplest thing, which is something that cannot be overstated, is really market size. It's like it's so fascinating now with the just the different experience. So we have a couple of ventures in the US, a couple of ventures in Europe, and then obviously a few ventures in Africa, right? And the single biggest impact on whether the business will be successful, in my opinion, is like how big is that market, and like it permeates everything. It permeates your likelihood to get capital. It permeates the likelihood for you to attract top talent. It goes through kind of all of this, right? And I think South African founders, just from a worldview perspective and an outlook perspective, have not that much exposure to what international markets look like. So even when we're doing ventures in Africa now, all the ventures that we would back are things that can be Pan-African, which means they're usually in some format around aggregation of things, or these things which are, in my opinion, probably the best place to go if you're looking for scale in Africa. Obviously, there's like mobile money and things like that, and banking, which are obviously huge markets in one single market, but they're much more tricky to make work. And effectively the overall likelihood that it's big enough is tough, right? Maybe I'll add like one way of thinking about it, right? If you look at the US, I mean, the US makes a lot of fun of Europe because it's kind of a play market, right? Which is I find so funny because obviously I'm sitting there thinking of Africa, being like, yeah, but so like it's got one single market, 300 and something million people, right? And in this whole kind of setup, it's the same kind of legal structure. You can scale into it pretty big. And where the real money gets made in venture, and this is maybe to maybe generalize a bit, but the real money gets made in ABC rounds, Series ABC, right? Like that's when early stage venture gets out. That's when growth capital comes in. That's where you basically create the decacorns, the 100 billion companies. Like that's like where like you actually become a big listed company or you stay a big startup, right? And like if you look at Europe, what do companies that are at Series A do? They basically are trying to figure out how to move to France, like add France as a country or add the UK. Completely different problems. Like in the US, people are
Mm,
struggling at Series A with like, how am I going to pump more money into growth in the same
mm,
channels just to
mm,
get bigger, right? Now you look at Africa and you think it's like 54 countries, each of which is economically smaller than like, you know, a mid-sized to small-sized European country, right? I mean, I read a stat the other day, which is that Standard Bank, I think, I don't know which year this was, but the capital, the bank with the most capital under management in Africa is Standard Bank, and it has less
mm,
capital than the Bank of Hamburg,
mm.
Oh my gosh.
which is really tough. I mean, it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
But
But even Louis, I mean, if you compare the sizes of the states of America, like individual states like Texas or California, I mean, they would be like top 10 GDP if they were independent
I mean,
countries. So
California is
it's
like the
really
eighth.
hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard for people to understand that. Like a state in America is substantially bigger than all the countries in Africa.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And that's the thing. I mean, if you look then back and you just bring it back to South Africa and you look and like, my advice to founders wanting to build something is don't settle with regards to building something that like take time to find a market that is truly big. Like for a long time, I mean, when I was early in my career, I also made the mistake of, people want to know what the market size is on the market size slide, and you go and you put some numbers together, and it's like 100 million, and you're like, oh, it's a big number, like
It's a
excellent, right?
gazillion, it's a billion. We have to build it.
It's like there's big and then there's big, right? And then there's like really big.
Yeah.
And like and you can think just very like don't settle on it, right? Like big markets are like, like hundreds of billion, right? Like look for hundreds
Mm,
of billions of euro, hundreds of billions of dollars. Like even if, and there are markets that exist, and your goal should be to find the narrowest entry point product wise
mm,
to over $100 billion market, because saying
mm,
that B2B HR is a $1 trillion market doesn't mean anything, because you can't service B2B HR, right?
mm,
You're trying to find like very narrow and deep markets. And if you look at examples in South Africa of narrow and deep markets, you're thinking of something like Yoko, right? You're thinking
mm,
of things that have like thousands and like hundreds of thousands of customers, mobile money, these kind of things, right? Where it's basically like a very deep market, very simple product.
mm,
And I feel that a lot of South African founders go and do something where they're like, you know what, I'm going to build something for, like, very South African-ish, like mid-sized, more white-collar tech product. And then you kind of look at it and you're like, that's really good. Like, don't get me wrong, you can build a business there, and it will work, right?
mm,
And I know I back you. Smart guy, smart girl. But I mean, really, if you think about it, you're missing if you're not mainly drawn to solving that problem for a different life reason, like it's something that you kind of, experience growing up, or you have an affinity to the problem, like take a
mm,
think and just go and like think about which other markets are out there, even if it's international, and spend 6 months, spend 12 months searching for a market. Like
mm,
don't spend 5 years building a business with a small market and then learn this afterwards, right? You're going to learn
mm,
the same lessons in a big market
mm,
versus small market, right? The big market is much easier because people will actually find backing you interesting,
mm.
whereas in a small market, they just don't, right?
But Louis, I think you touched on something very important earlier, where the size of the market, for obvious reasons, traction, getting investors, getting the employees want to come and work with you, like all of that stuff's easy. I think probably one of the most underrated reasons is you can get early customers that give you feedback, like, and lots of them, which is so hard to get in South Africa. You can, if you're building something niche B2B in South Africa, you might get one customer or two, but they don't respond to you, they don't really give you sound feedback. Like if you
Yeah.
launch in a bigger market, you can get like 10 customers in a few months, and all of them would give you different unique feedback, which would make iterating so much easier and quicker to
Yep.
actually help you build faster and better.
It's Another great reason, right? It's also, I mean, the other thing that's also kind of hard to explain the difference in the regions. And I'm not saying that means that all South African founders must try to build an international business, but the hard currency value of like charging in dollars or something like this, it just fuels the growth of the business very quickly,
Mm,
right? Like in South Africa, like especially in certain like things, you'll sell an enterprise product and you'll like make like 20K, like, and
mm,
like the sales cycle is huge and the willingness to
Mm,
pay is just small because it's not
mm,
easy, right?
mm,
But I mean, we're going into too much detail on it, but I think that that's the thing. Market size and the rest, like the founder skills, the founder experience, these are things that is your job to learn. You got to be
mm,
gritty, you got to be all those things. Like I'm not taking that away, but like make sure you're on the right wicket before you start playing because you won't have time to look up most of that time when you're building the business.
mm,
So I can't not ask you. So obviously when you're building your startup, and we're back in the day when I was with you guys, like it was expensive to, it was tough. Like you said, it was hard to find a developer and they were expensive.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 2023, 4 and 5, and there's this thing called AI that's just exploding and making things easier and quicker to build. What is the impact do you feel on taking this approach? Like I can get there quicker. I mean, you still have to find the market, right? So that doesn't change. But what is the impact do you feel on these MVPs that we're building and those validating
Mm.
processes? What's the impact that you are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, right? There's a lot to unpack. I mean, I'm just going to focus on the venture and like what it allows them to do. But I think what's interesting now is that in good ventures, the bottleneck has always been understanding the customer and an insight into what is going to be a product that they will use and doing that for a market that you can scale into. Like that's actually the hard part of building a venture. Up until now, there's been a price tag associated with making tests to understand whether or not you're right. That price
Hmm.
tag gets lower and lower. But what it does, which is interesting, is even though people can now build an MVP and these things much, much cheaper, the challenge that happens is that it's now just hyper focusing all of the success or no success on do you understand the customer and can you scale it, right? So I think that
Yeah.
it doesn't it doesn't really help all founders in the same way. What it does do is it helps founders with like unfair access to network or unfair access to existing customers or deep knowledge of a particular problem to not require as much financing to get it done, which is we're
mm,
seeing a lot with these kind of like AI, like, not always AI, but like under 10-person unicorns, right? Like, or not under 10,
mm,
close to 10-person unicorns, right? Which is super interesting. Um,
mm,
I think in general, what I've seen up until now is that, the same structure of the market with developers working on like more scaled out products is still the same. It just ends up being they're just doing more, right? So in the bigger teams with the more established products, things like Cursor are helping them be more effective, like these co-pilots, these things. But it's I think it's still relatively few years away until like an enterprise product, just gets kind of spun out, just purely out of that. And I've played with things like Lovable and that. And
Mm.
the big challenge I see with them right now is that, there's a process, and I think you'd love this, Bobby, but like there's a product thinking process that goes into building a business. And the biggest failure point I see right now of being able to just jump up and make it is basically that the products are not thought through.
People
Like, and
building crap.
it's people
They're
are
rushing.
people are building it quick, but it's
That's
pretty
crap.
crappy.
Yeah.
And then
And it's
basically
not
they
crap technically, it's just it's not
Yeah.
addressing the need.
yeah, that and then what happens technically is now you've built it once, and now you need to try and refactor to change the flow through these
Chuck it
tools,
away.
which
Yeah,
basically like
exactly.
I've seen one or two founders who have they're on their like sixth rebuild. I mean, it's magical that you can go to a rebuild and do it yourself at night, right? Like, don't get me wrong, but I
Mm,
think that it still comes down to like that product thinking, that understanding the
mm,
customer, like the value
Mm,
that you're
mm.
creating, and then commercialization has always been, it's always this funny thing is everyone's like getting the product right is the hardest thing until you go to the next phase. Like commercializing is the hardest thing, right?
selling it, man.
But I
Yeah.
personally,
getting it out there.
commercialization is much harder. Like it's just
Yeah.
many orders of magnitude
And
harder.
sustaining it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is
And
where
I
it
mean,
gets really tough.
and like, yeah, and then like there's competition and these things, and like that's the one thing that's also it struck me about the difference between South Africa and Europe, right? It's just the competition level is like very very different, right? In South Africa, like there will be a player that will build out a tool and become the company, very, very
Mhm.
easily. There might be one or two other small ones and these things, but you watch these companies come and go over like many years, right? Like, they
Mhm.
at the different startup events for like 4 or 5 years before they get to that
Yeah,
point,
the
right?
people in
And it's great.
generations, they just come
Yeah,
and go, and we forget about
yeah.
them 3 years later.
And that's also just because I think there's very little market entry from international
Mm.
competitors, right? There's no one coming to South Africa, right? It's like, it's like feeling like Take a Lot with Amazon coming. But in Germany,
Mm.
I mean, there's like, there's US companies coming in. There's like,
Mm.
it's like topsy-turvy stuff, man. People are like getting the MVP out, like, this other like whatever, in Germany, there's it's like a accounting system called Datev. It's terrible, in my opinion. Anyway, don't want to slander them, but like, now everybody's realized that, okay, cool, like this is a big opportunity. Tech is easy enough now to get into that market. It's like 20. And there's like international people and zeros building like a German version. And like it's just
Wow.
like all comes
Chaos.
together and the competition is huge. Like it's like in South Africa, it's like Simple Pay, right? Simple Pay is a crazy business. They've been around for such a long time. They have a huge market share. They built the product like bit by bit for like 10 years.
Mm.
And they're like the market leader. It's like it's just different, right?
So we need to start wrapping up, but I have to touch on the campus because before we started the episode, I mentioned, I remember sitting on a Teams, not Teams, Twitch, on a call, on a company call, and you brought up, we have this idea of starting this campus, and I honestly thought you guys were cooked, and here you are, a couple of years later, we can see it in your background. The campus is live. It's in Berlin. Tell us very quickly about it and what you want to achieve with
Mm.
it.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I mean, it's lovely to come full circle on this call, right?
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, the campus has always been, for the past 3 4 years, this like dream project. And the premise about it is like very early on, we had this in Cape Town, we had this slightly bigger office, and it was awesome to have the ventures in there and the proximity and these things, and like that was great. It never went anywhere, obviously, because you build a services business on the one side that has like very kind of strict clients. You like, and they're like, who are these randos walking around your office? You're like, you start realizing you can't really do that. But that was where the kind of seed started for me, which is like having this kind of overlap with clients, overlap with portfolio companies, and really bringing them together in a way that creates the serendipitous unlock of value, right?
Mm.
And I realized that like to actually get it done, you need to build it in a way that it is self-sufficient, right? And that's like some principle I've used throughout Delta to ensure that the business units are kind of standalone like business units, right? So we worked on trying to find the right building for a long time, and we settled here in an area of Berlin called Neukölln, which it's relatively central, and the building is a 12,000 square meter old parking lot, a garage
Oh,
actually. And now it's kind of just a slightly fancier startup garage.
You're
And
pretty
literally
fancy from
building
here.
startups out of a garage.
it's basically a fancy garage. Yeah, I mean you can see it in the background.
I
So it's
mean,
got this atrium of the garage, and in there used to be the kind of swirly thing the cars drive up, right?
Oh,
We
wow,
got
that's so
we got rid
cool.
of
so
that.
so Louis, just question: do Germans like puns? Because I can just imagine the startup garage thing just going crazy.
They don't. The Germans don't like that
I
much.
thought so.
I would need to submit a memo to explain it.
Oh
Like,
no.
oh man,
Yeah, I
but
think you need more South Africans there, Louis, to keep it
Yeah,
fresh.
yeah, I'm
I
trying,
think this
man.
is why he
Anyone?
comes back to South Africa in here.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah,
I get
that
my
makes
fix every
sense.
summer. Yeah, but I mean, at the moment now, so there's like 6 floors in it. I'm sitting on the ground floor now, which is this kind of event ecosystem home. We have a university on the first floor, actually, called Code University. So they're a very entrepreneurial
Very cool.
university. A lot of our studio ventures actually come from founders that come through there.
Nice.
We have a lot of overlap. Then we've got kind of three floors of co-working. The offices get nicer the higher up you go. So it's kind of like a game. Like if you make it to
You're
Series
gamifying
A,
growth.
yeah. So it's basically like pre-seed, seed, Series A, and then the top floor is rented by one of our
Excellent.
most successful ventures, WeFox. So
All
basically,
right.
you make it to that stage, you get the top floor, and
Well,
yeah,
you have to
it's
clip
it's
them then, eh? That's a tough one.
yeah, it's gonna be tough to reach that. But and then on the roof we got a pool to keep it because I mean we need to be able to have a South African braai
Nice.
at one time, right? So that's
Fair
kind
enough.
of
Yes.
my promise to any South African who comes here at one point.
Little braai
I'll
on the
do a
pool.
braai for you at
Okay.
on one
I'm coming.
Saturday. Yeah, I'll have you guys over. We can do a follow-up podcast.
Yeah, yeah,
Braai.
Yes.
absolutely. I'm in.
Yeah.
Awesome. Louis, it was awesome to catch up again. It's been a couple of years, and like I said, to see the stories evolve and come to fruition is quite amazing. So awesome. Well done. Thank you for all that you've done and for sharing your story. Renee, any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
Yeah, Louis, just like I said, met so many founders that come out of the Delta stable, and it's great to see you still going, still have a passion for South Africa, and excited to see how this next chapter unfolds with you for the campus and everything you're doing on that side. And yeah, let's do more things together.
Yeah, great. Happy to. Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.